Hi, good evening. Hola a todos. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Art and America Society, we are delighted to welcome you this afternoon to Amazonia Zoo Conference. Today's program features two panels. The first is organized in partnership with the Amazon Basin as Connecting Borderland project and brings together its directors, Maria Barbara, Patricia Salamea, and Carmen Fernandez Salvador, along with Amazonia Zoo co-curator and project contributor Diana Iturralde. The second panel focuses on Ruja el Bosque, a project dedicated to environmental and plurilingual poetics organized as a series of regional anthologies. Its founder and director, Valeria Mailer, will be in conversation with professor and researcher Fernando Lofredo. Unfortunately, Joseph Pierce, who was going to participate this afternoon, is unable to join. Today, as you know, we had to change dates due to our beautiful weather. So first of all, thank you all for being here, wearing snow boots. Thank you. This conference is in conjunction with the exhibition Amazonia Zoo, co-curated by Grace Anaisa Ali, Christian Bendayan, Elvira Espejo Aica, Diana Iturralde, Miguel Kirler, NouN and TUC, Mateus Nunes, Luis Romero, and Maria Wills, with Keina Eyelson serving as curatorial advisor. The presentation of Amazonia Zoo is made possible by generous support from the William Talbot Hillman Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Consulate General of Brazil in New York, with the Instituto Guimarães Rosa, the Couch Charitable Trust, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts, with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature. In-kind support is provided by the Hochschild Collection, Hochschild Correa Collection, and Instituto de Visión. We are also deeply grateful to our Art of the Americas Circle members for their continued support of our programming, and of course, to our speakers and all of you. Following the program, we will invite you to join us for a small reception next door. And you will also have the opportunity to connect with one of my colleagues, Holly, who is actually there. Hi, Holly, who will be holding up one of our tote bags, yeah, to learn more about our individual membership program, including new exclusive events and benefits. And the galleries will remain open in case you want to visit again Amazonia Zoo. We are honored to introduce Maria Barbara, who is professor of art history at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. She specializes in Italian and Iberian art produced between 15th and 17th centuries, as well as in cultural history, early modern globalism, and intellectual interchange in the Atlantic world. Patricia Salamea is associate professor of art history at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, where she served as dean of the School of Arts and Humanities from 2015 to 2021. Carmen Fernandez Salvador, who is professor of art history at the Universidad de San Francisco de Quito, and Diana Iturralde, who is the 2024-2026 Cisneros Institute Research Fellow at MoMA and a PhD candidate in art history at Rutgers University. She specializes in modern and contemporary art from Latin America, and her dissertation examines visual representation of cultural and environmental transformations in the Andean Amazon region from the 19th century to the present. So, with no further ado, please, if you want to join me here. Thank you, and enjoy.
Good afternoon again. I was just saying we're delighted to be here after, I'm sure the same for all of you. We were trying to get here desperately. We finally made it. So first of all, thank you so much, Carla, for organizing this, for our conversations that led to this day. So I will be speaking, as you can see, about this project titled The Amazon Basin as Connecting Borderlands, which we have co-organized with Carmen and Maria for the past 3 years. It has a subtitle, Examining Cultural and Artistic Fluidities in the Early Modern Period, when in fact you'll see that it's a much broader project, but that's how it got started. It's a project that has been funded by the Connecting Art Histories program of the Getty Foundation. Thanks to the generosity of the Getty, we have been able to travel, develop research together with a group of over 30 participants for the past 2 long years. So very quickly, one word about the image that you see there. It's a logo showing the region of the Amazon basin as a map, as a concept, as an image, which is behind the idea that that has been behind all of this, which is to think transregionally, beyond national borders, which is or the ways in which many times the art history of our countries is told. So it has to do with the way art history is told, but it also has to do with interdisciplinary question, which, as you'll see, is what does art history have to do with all of this? So this is our team, including Julian Serna, who was the project coordinator. The three of us are early modern art historians, which is why I mentioned originally the project began from that framework, and it expanded due to what we have been learning and navigating for the past 3 years. We've worked with 3 collaborators based in each one of our countries: Jens Baumgarten in Sao Paulo, Maria Patricia Ordóñez also in Quito, and Natalia Lozada at the Universidad de los Andes with me in Bogota, Colombia. So the way this project worked was it's been a traveling seminar. We had a call for participants. Diana was one of them, and we've had this spread out over the past 2 years. And so you're going to see here, the first year took place physically in Ecuador, but we spent a year having monthly seminars with invited guest lectures, with readings, together with a group of young scholars, graduates, postgraduates, postdocs from different countries from South America, as you can see here. And this included 3 postdocs and on-site research assistants that worked together with us throughout the project and on site. We had these seminars. I won't go through everything, but it's to give you a sense of what we were doing with a number of different guests coming really from very different backgrounds, which is, I think, one of the major points of interest for us, is that it's really a conversation with different disciplines, all the way from, we'll say, archaeology and anthropology, but also, in a broader sense, Amazonian studies. We also had artists, we had environmental experts, and so forth. So in our first year in 2003, we went to Ecuador, where I cannot emphasize enough the on-site experience and what this really achieves. And part of it was traveling, starting in Quito and going down to the Amazon on a bus ride that took us all the way to Sarayaku, an indigenous community from the Quechua Nation, down the river, 3 days, where we really had a marvelous experience throughout these days as guests. And you can see some images here all the way in the center, from standing outside the church, the Jesuit church in Quito, going down the river to the community, but also having the opportunity to be behind the scenes in museums, in the reserves. And at the same time, we had a symposium that was online, open to the public, with presentations of the different participants. The whole goal of this is to create knowledge as we were having this experience. So I'd like to invite you also to check out our website and read the student blogs, as we've called them. It's really travel logs from the participants during the seminar, all the way from everyday experiences with the travels, with objects, with quotidianity, but also early, let's say, research projects that are now turning into articles or dissertations or other types of publications. For our second year, we went to Brazil. We had a very different experience. Again, we had new participants in addition to participants from the first year. We had one postdoc that continued, and then other new assistants and postdocs. And this time we went to Belém do Pará, which is on the Atlantic coast. Completely different site, as you can see here. It looks like Manhattan, but in the middle of the Amazon. So it was an experience in a city with an Amazonic history and identity that, again, throughout various days, we had the opportunity to go through collections, speaking to people who live in Belém, and we had our symposium took place there in person at the Center for Memory of Amazonia. And here are some images in the museums, forts, theaters, the Jesuit church, ruins, and really part of the memory of the city, which has a lot more to do with the early 20th century than anything else. And so what we are planning to do now, of course, the project is coming to an end in one way, but it's really opening doors in many other ways. And we're in the midst of having a third and final trip. In 2 weeks, we'll be in Leticia in Colombia, which is really a city that connects Peru and Brazil and Colombia, literally crossing the street or the river, where we'll have a final meeting to think about how to go from here. One, something that will come out very soon is this dossier in a journal called H Art, the Journal for History, Art, and Theory that is based at Uniandes that we're editing with Carmen and Maria, where we had a call for papers last year, and the number will come out now in May. So look forward to that. We also have a series of, we have our webpage, but we also have, you can see an Instagram that can be followed, and also a Facebook with more or less the record of what we have been doing, but also, again, looking towards the future. So we look forward to discussing more about this later now during the roundtable, but let me just, again, frame this project within the larger question, which was, what is the role of art history in a region such as the Amazon today, and how has this not only transformed the way in which we move in this discipline, but what can be brought to art history and what can art history bring back to this region. So we'll be delighted to talk about this in a little while. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to Maria.
Yes. See. Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Again, I'll be quick. I'm not going to present to you a paper or an academic article, but just I would like to point out one of the aspects that we've been trying to deal with in our project, which is cartography. How to imagine spaces. Maps are not only a way of telling you how to go from A to B, but also a way of imagining a place. How was the Amazon imagined cartographically? How was it mapped? This is something that we thought a lot during our project. And another key concept of the project is extractivism and neo-extractivism. So the idea of the Amazon as a place where there's plenty, it's abundant, you can take whatever you want to take from the forest, and it will recover. So this mentality that in a way lives up to nowadays has deep roots, really goes back to 16th century, 17th century. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how was it visually created, this idea. So I'd like to begin with this photo, with this beautiful image by a Brazilian photographer. I'm sure many of you know Sebastião Salgado. Sadly, we lost him last year. He's one of these people who never should die, really, but he left us, and he did really left us some very beautiful images. And I think that in a way, this photo for me stands in opposition to some of the images that we'll see now. So I'm going to be talking first. We're going to talk about some extractivist approaches to the Amazon region during the 20th century military dictatorship, which happened between 64 and 85, and its revival. We had a very strong revival of these narratives, developmentalist, in Portuguese you'd say desenvolvimentista, I don't know if it would make sense in English, narratives under Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, and how it connects to 16th and 17th century spatial constructions of the Amazon. So the military dictatorship of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century in Brazil, devised a strategic plan grounded in strong nationalistic propaganda to occupy and exploit the resources of the Brazilian Amazon. Although rhetorically framed in nationalist discourse, the systematic destruction of the forest was closely linked to private multinational corporations, as evidenced by by those ads from the early 1970s, and this is, those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s are very well familiarized with this kind of image. Let's conquer the Amazon, let's make profit from the Amazon. Now the Amazon is a no person's land. It's empty. This idea that the forest is empty, it has always been empty, no one's there, and we have to, it's there for us to take advantage. That was the discourse. And it was deeply revived during the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro between 2018 and 2022. So this is just an example. So in May 2020, so we're talking really in the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, a video recording of a ministerial meeting held on April 22 revealed that the then Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, is on our right, had proposed that the government take advantage of the media's near-exclusive focus on COVID-19 to run the cattle through. Passar a boiada, it says in Portuguese. The video was leaked, caused scandal, but just for a little while. So now, between January 2019 and February 21, Brazil approved 57 pieces of legislation that weakened environmental protections, according to the journal Biological Conservation. Almost half of these measures, 27 bills, were passed during the height of Brazil's COVID-19 pandemic between March and September 2020. And Manaus, which is the capital of the Amazon state in Brazil, was the one with the highest death tolls by then. In June 21, Ricardo Salles requested to step down from the Bolsonaro administration after being accused of involvement in an illegal scheme to export timber to Europe and to the United States. In 22, he was elected as a federal representative, deputado federal. There is not a direct correspondence with the US political system, for the state of São Paulo by the conservative Liberal Party. Be careful, Partido Liberal is the far-right party in Brazil. So now, so we see how this was very clearly, I mean, we can see the reflex of these politics. This is the export of brute timber, of brute wood. In yellow, we see money, US increase in money for export between 2017 and 2021, and in blue, the volume. So after 2022, it stepped down again. It's not as extreme, but we are not quite there yet in terms of making it good. So it's still bad. Now, let's go back in time. So we're talking about wood and about timber. And I'd like to show you this image, which is from a sheet from an atlas, from a 16th century atlas. And I'd like to call your attention to this map. So on the right, we see Africa, Europe, which is the oikoumene, or the habitable world as it was known, the old world, so to speak, which was Africa, Asia, and Europe. And to the left, we see the so-called New World. And corresponding to the Amazon, sort of, we see this huge bunch of trees surrounded by two rivers, which were the Plata in the south and the Amazon in the north, because some cartographers imagined that those rivers would meet in this kind of oasis in the middle of the continent. And we see this image is very telling because the whole world is arid. The whole world has no trees. Those are the lonely trees, but they are there. This idea that the Amazon or the American tropics are the lungs of the world. I don't know if you have heard this expression, but in Portuguese is a common expression. And we see this again and again, the representation of extractivism in those maps. So here what we are seeing are Tupi populations, so populations living actually in coastal zones, harvesting Brazil wood, which is now an endangered species. It doesn't exist anymore. And we're going to see, actually, it was a case of near extinction already in the 16th century due to massive extractivism. We see the negotiation, barter between European traders and Tupi people who are harvesting Brazil wood. Again, we see another, this time from a Portuguese cartographer, we see not only the extraction, but also the exploitation of labor, of indigenous labor for this process, because of course you need somebody to get the wood and fill in the boats. Of course, the Amazon River there, like a snake, it's a kind of very common. Again, in prints, we see athletic indigenous people ready to harvest, and those images work as a kind of positive propaganda. So here there is timber, it's abundant, and people are well-behaved and domesticated enough that they will, for very little, for just a little piece of mirror, they will go and they will do the job for us. That's the message of those images. That's the agenda, to convince political entities and governments in Europe to invest in colonization. And to me, this image is very beautiful. On the right, of course, it's a detail, but we see what is nowadays Brazil, a couple harvesting Brazil wood. There are so many hints in this image that we can think about how the idea of fertility is there. So we see a couple, the woman has a baby, more people are going to be born, more trees are going to grow. We see the trees are being chopped, but they're also growing again. We see this stream that gives a kind of a pastoral feeling to the whole idea. So it's an idea, it's a bit paradise, which sometimes we see in those images as well. But again, the idea of extractivism, this is a kind of a proto-capitalistic paradise. We can go there, we can harvest these things forever. There's always going to be wood. There's always going to be people who get it for us. And now, so this is the last image that I'm going to show you. The logic of large-scale accumulation began to take shape in early modernity. The contemporary extractivist mentality that we have nowadays, that is so present nowadays, can be traced back to early modern European colonial expansion. Maps produced in the 16th century played a fundamental role in publicizing the American tropics as spaces of abundance, resilience, and spontaneous regeneration. With the industrialization of southern Brazil and the implementation of aggressive developmentalist, sorry if it's a neologism, policies in the 20th century, the legacy of this process largely shifted to the Amazon region, so from the coast to the Amazon. Thank you so much. Carmen.
La explicación que me... Ya, gracias. Gracias. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again to the Americas Society for having us here today. Well, I'm actually going to talk about my recent research, and I was talking this morning about this. I've been working with the Jesuits for a very long time. The Jesuits during the colonial period for a very long time. And the thing is that when I was reading their descriptions of the work they were doing in South America, I was always struck by the emphasis they placed on materials and colors and all the things that they found and the textiles. Meaning they really admired the craft of indigenous peoples. So what I'm doing now is I'm leaving Quito, which is where I was working before, and I'm going to the frontier to the missions in Minas. And I think that I have to go to the next. Thank you. So, and I'm going to talk about something very different. I haven't presented this at all. This is something very new to me. But downstairs, you have a lanchama. That is the canvas of a painting, right? So I'm going to start with that. Okay, there you go. Wonder of nature or artifice. The lanchama has been described as a natural textile produced by indigenous peoples from the Amazon using the inner bark of trees. It has been traditionally used for making clothing, blankets, and more recently, as a canvas for paintings. Making the lanchama is time-consuming since it involves stripping the bark, soaking it and pounding it with wooden mallets until it becomes soft and flexible. Oftentimes, lanchamas are decorated with seeds or feathers and are painted with natural dyes and pigments. This lanchama, the one that I'm showing you here, belonged to the private collection of Marcos Jiménez de la Espada, a Spanish naturalist and historian who formed part of the Scientific Commission of the Pacific. This was an expedition that explored South America between 1862 and 1866, collecting botanical specimens. During the expedition, Jiménez de la Espada and his peers traveled through Ecuador, particularly the Amazon, where he acquired objects made by indigenous communities from the region, such as the lanchama, as well as a woman's skirt, also manufactured from tree bark and ornamented with seeds and elytra. The lanchama and other things collected by the scientists in the Ecuadorian Amazon, garments, shields, and necklaces, were first presented to the European public in an exhibition that took place in Madrid in 1881, in conjunction with the Fourth Congress of Americanists. Just as the Scientific Commission, the exhibition and the Congress had to do with Spain's interest in shaping an imperial science, while strengthening its cultural ties with Latin America under the idea of Pan-Hispanism. A description of the exhibition also emphasized scientific study of these objects in connection to the emergence of ethnography as an academic discipline. But the truth is that lanchamas had reached European collections way before the ethnographic interest of 19th century Americanists. In a letter written in 1667, Jean Muret, a French diplomat to the court of Charles II of Spain, describes with great admiration what he calls the treasure of all the precious things produced in the Indies, which were displayed clearly in the king's Wunderkammer. He notes that in this place he had seen Moctezuma's garments, others that belonged to the Incas of Peru, as well as stone-made mirrors, bed curtains manufactured with feathers, and many other things that appeared new and unique. But first on his list are tapestries made from tree bark. It is possible that these tapestries, most probably lanchamas, were presented as a gift to the Spanish king either by colonial officers or religious envoys who were trying to secure the support from the crown for the material and spiritual conquest of the Amazon. The tapestries may have accompanied reports, such as those written by the Jesuit Cristobal de Acuña, who underscored the availability of resources in the region, but also the possibility of conversion. In this context, the skill and artistry of indigenous artisans evidenced the cultural advancement of Amazonian peoples and the readiness to embrace Christian religion. Thus, on his travel account of the Amazon from Quito to Pará, kind of like what we did, but we flew. He actually walked and took and navigated on a boat. And this was a trip that he took place in 1639. Acuña praises the beauty and delicate work of things made locally, with only animals' teeth and fangs, as well as the colorful textiles worn by some of the peoples that he encountered during his trip. Finally, he affirms that they make an idol, which comes out so naturalistic that our sculptors could learn a lot from them. The fact that in the Spanish court, these tapestries were displayed alongside garments that belonged to Aztec and Inca lords suggests that they were indeed held in great esteem. However, they were also contemplated as exotic and curious objects of wonder. This said, the making of natural textiles in missionary contexts during the colonial period, as well as the exhibition and circulation of tapestries, had a very different aim from that of European collecting practices in early modernity, as well as from the 19th century scientific gaze. While marveling at the sight of these textiles and singular manufacturing technique, missionary accounts also suggest the possibility of integrating them into Christian religious practices and in the process incorporating them into what Tom Cummins and Johan Rappaport describe as an orthodox visual culture. And I'm also following Guillermo Vildes' discussion of emerging materialities, a concept that he uses to define the visual and material culture or frontier zones, as were the Jesuit missions in South America, and which he notes were marked by transculturation and mestizaje, but also by continuity of traditions. And then for a little bit of context, These accounts were written by Jesuits working in the missions of Maynas, which extended roughly from what are now eastern Ecuador, northeastern Peru, and southeastern Colombia. At the time, however, Maynas belonged to the Jesuit province of Quito, as demonstrated in the map made by the Jesuits Carolus Brentano and Nicolás de la Torre, and engraved in Italy in 1751. It is important to point out, too, that the missions were multicultural places, with missionaries, many of them trained as artisans, coming from Spain, Italy, Bohemia, or the Tyrol, while recent converts also belonged to different indigenous nationalities. Missionary accounts, particularly those written during the 18th century, emphasize the usefulness and quality of the woods, resins, and dyes from the Amazon, which were used for the construction and ornamentation of religious buildings. The missions in Maynas, in this sense, may have functioned as a sort of laboratory. That is, missionaries and European artisans worked alongside indigenous painters, carpenters, sculptors, and weavers, allowing experimentation with local materials and technologies, as well as the transfer of local and traditional knowledges. These materials and knowledges were appropriated not just by missionaries, but also by artisanal workshops in larger larger artistic and urban centers. Regarding resins, missionaries and other Jesuit authors describe the use of copal for making mezzotints, but also heads and hands for sculptures. Copaiba, which had medicinal properties, was also valued for the luster it gave to objects, helping artists to make the most brilliant paintings with very vivid colors. According to the Jesuit Mario Chicala, Copaiba permitted artists to imitate with absolute likeness and perfection the adornment of Chinese and Japanese porcelain. Various authors also discuss the quality of local pigments. Achote, or chambu, which was traditionally used for bodily decoration, had also migrated to artisanal workshops in Quito and other cities, and was used, according to Father Francis Vegel, for making the best liquid cinnabar. As for indigo blue, he writes that it couldn't grow like weed. Missionaries also found a large variety of mineral pigments or earth colors. While indigenous artisans had previously employed such pigments on pots and clay vessels, missionaries had started to use them in the decoration of churches, making paintings to instill religious zeal among neophytes. The manufacture and decoration of textiles was also discussed extensively, since Jesuit authors saw them as cultural markers. In the eyes of the missionaries, more barbarous peoples were typically naked. However, some nations did wear woven fabrics made with vegetable threads, while others dyed these fabrics with vivid colors. It is in this context that lanchamas are discussed. Vegel provides a detailed explanation of the making process of lanchamas, which he describes as tela natural, or natural fabric, calling it, and I love this, obra maestra de la naturaleza, or a masterpiece of nature. He marvels at the texture and sheer whiteness of the final product, and suggests that even though it was a natural object, it appeared manufactured with exquisitely fine veins interwoven with such care. Just like natural pigments and resins, lanchamas could be incorporated into Christian religious practice, while the making of lanchamas, which implied the domestication of nature, was clearly seen as a sign of industry. Its use in a Christian context could stand as a metaphor, I don't know if this is the correct word, for the conversion of indigenous people. And for this, I would like to turn to the writings of another missionary, Manuel de Uriarte, who worked in Maynas for approximately 17 years. Uriarte was writing in Ravenna, where he lived after the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish American territories. His account, in this sense, is heavily filtered by memories of Quito and of the mission in Maynas, but also by the things he was reading and seeing during his stay in Italy. Quite probably, too, he was sharing conversations and concerns with other members of his order who were also writing about the province of Quito and other provinces in Spanish America. However, he also provides detailed information about the building and ornamentation of churches and of the indigenous and European artisans working in the missions that are probably accurate. His Diario de un Misionero was transcribed by Constantino Bale and has been published in various editions. However, the printed version overlooks the small drawings made by the author. Not very good drawings, but they're interesting anyway, which also provide additional information for the reader. The text and image relation was clearly aligned also with scientific writings of the period. In both his diary and his letters, Uriarte writes about images that arrived oftentimes as presents from Quito or even from Europe to the missions in Minas. Only once he mentions something that he had sent to Europe. 2 altar hangings with the sacred hearts painted with herbal juices. Uriarte describes these blankets as treasures of the Indies. And he notes that he had sent them to Spain because of their curious decoration. Perhaps not very different from feather mosaics, like the one I'm showing you. We only know that it was made in South America, or the Mexican feather mosaics, which were sent to the Pope. The Minas blankets were meant to be seen not just as exotic objects, but also as tangible evidence of the success attained by missionaries in the Amazon, the depiction of the sacred monograms. Well, we don't know for certain that the hangings sent to Spain were indeed lanchamas. We do have evidence that these were used by missionaries and that they had entered Christian sacred spaces. At the beginning of his account, Uriarte notes that converts living in the mission of San Luis de Tiriri wore lanchamas, which he immediately translates for the reader as cortezas or tree barks. In the next volume, he described the church of Nombre de Jesús and its main altarpiece, adorned with cortezas blanqueadas or bleached barks and mantas de lamas. He adds that next to the main altarpiece, there was a niche with tree barks sewn together with fibers. And I'm sorry for the people who are sitting back there because I don't know if you're going to see what I'm going to show you, but anyway, more interesting is the information he provides about the mission of Santa Maria de Nanay. Uriarte notes that Brother Schoenemann, who was the curate of the mission, had built the town with its indigenous residents. He describes the church, which was made of local materials, bareque or wattle and dove, and palm trees, and the curious altarpiece made of cedar. But here, in this description, he momentarily arrests his narrative, his text, to introduce the drawing of the monogram of Jesus. Can you see it? It's like the 6th line or something. So he's writing, and then he stops and introduces the drawing. But what is really interesting about the drawing is that he says that it was painted on an altar frontal made of tree bark. It was Christianized. The tree bark was Christianized. So I'm going to finish with this. To conclude, and the people who made this video are also in the exhibition downstairs. And to conclude, I wanted to leave you with one thought. In the present, lanchamas are being used as a canvas for painting by indigenous artisans in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, and we have an example of this in the exhibition. However, making the lanchamas is also a tradition at risk, as explained in this short documentary about Zapara clothing in the Ecuadorian Amazon, threatened by increased introduction of commercial clothing. Thank you very much. And Diana. Paso la post.
Okay, with my presentation, we're gonna jump back to the present. And I'll try to breach the project we've been talking about with the exhibition downstairs. I'd like to start by thanking Carmen, Maria, and Patricia for inviting me to participate as part of their panel in this conference, and to the America Society for the opportunity to be involved in this beautiful exhibition. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge all the other curators of the show: Maria, Cristian, Elvira, Mateus, Miguel, Luis, Grace, NouN, and Tuti. And especially to the participating artists without whom none of us would be here tonight. Their stories, represented by the works that you can see in the galleries downstairs, are and should remain central to our conversations tonight and hopefully hereafter. It was not a small task to put together an exhibition that represents such a large and complex region as the Amazon. It was equally challenging to agree on concepts, themes, and frameworks among 9 curators, all coming from different backgrounds and relations to the region. This show is a result of many rich conversations and exchanges that present Amazonia through a dynamic lens rather than a fixed framework. The Tupi suffix asu in the title Amazonia Asu functions as a Latin prefix pan, all-encompassing, to convey the region's breadth and scale, an idea borrowed from the project Baroque Asu with which curator Mateus Nunes was involved. In using Asu, the exhibition foregrounds an indigenous framework for thinking expansively. As a group of curators, our overarching objective is to understand the Amazon as a dynamic, diverse, and layered entity, plurinational and self-determined, one that defies the logics of arbitrary geopolitical borders. I was invited to speak tonight about the exhibition's curatorial process. As I cannot speak for the other curators involved, I will instead trace my own experience. During the first iteration of the Amazonian Basin in 2023, we traveled to many sites in the Ecuadorian Amazon. I was particularly struck by the ways in which art making, in tandem with oral traditions, carried knowledge across generations. On 2 occasions, we learned from Quechua women in Pastaza about the process and care involved in creating both everyday and ritual objects, from sourcing the materials needed to shaping, firing, and ultimately activating them in use. Through their teachings, we also learned about the centrality of memory as an active, dynamic form of knowledge, a living historical archive. These encounters continue to inform my approach to the region. When I was invited to participate as the Ecuadorian curator for the show, I knew that memory and orality as forms of knowledge would constitute a major through line among these artists and across the exhibition more broadly. As Ecuador declares itself as a plurinational state, I sought to foreground diversity by presenting distinct stories, perspectives, and approaches to art making. Having established as well as emerging artists was also paramount in achieving a balanced representation of artists in the region. As a non-Indigenous, non-Amazonian curator, it was clear to me that it was not my voice that should be telling these stories, but that of the artists who experienced them. And to achieve that, I wanted to create a relationship that would resolve around exchange rather than transaction. Throughout the process, we made on multiple occasions to listen about their stories and learn more about their practice. Together, we found ways to highlight their voice and develop the text to guide visitors and readers alike. Ultimately, through distinct yet resonant visual languages, these Ecuadorian artists engage with politics of care, memory, and reclamation. In their works, territory is envisioned not as a resource to be extracted, but as a living and contested ground of memory and political agency. With that framework in mind, allow me to share more about each of these Amazonian artists. Through the Amazon Basin Project, I was introduced to ceramic art making from Quechua women in Canelos and Sarayaku. This matrilineal practice known as awana, or weaving clay, reflects the same care, intimacy, and relationality as a textile. The 4 figures shown here represent supai, forest spirits, and are commonly activated with ritual contexts. Estela Dawa is one of the most renowned and prolific Quechua artists in Pastaza. Her works are held in museum, university, and private collections internationally. The effigies on the left may have been created for Ullanza, a weeks-long celebration of gratitude to Pachamama for her abundance and generosity. In this context, women create representations of Supai along contemporary figures, sustaining ancestral memory within present-day realities. The effigies take center stage during the festivities as they are used to pour chicha, a fermented beverage, over extended periods of communal gathering. Our engagement with these artists unfolded not only through workshops, but through sustained conversations about territorial defense and collective organizing. Noemi Walinga spoke to us about Mujeres Amazónicas Defensoras de la Selva, a collective dedicated to defending their communities and the forest from ongoing violence of exploitation and extractivism. Here, artistic practice and political action emerge from a shared commitment to sustain life. Nancy Santi, on the right, a member of this collective, is recognized as one of the most talented contemporary ceramists. This work was commissioned for the show in collaboration with Nina Walinga, who mediated the conversation between Santi and myself. Her two-piece work represents the story of Nonguli, a deity of fertility and caretaker of Alpamama, or Earth. In brief, the story tells how Nonguli taught a woman to nurture life by entrusting her with a child whose powerful song, so long as the child is kept close, ensures the sustenance of life on Earth. The work materializes this cosmological teaching. Fertility is not abstract, but relational. Sustenance depends on proximity, care, and attentive listening. And here, I want to draw some connections to the show, but for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to get into the details. Just some other, similar languages that are happening in tandem or in dialogue. Angélica Alomoto conceives art as activism and as a political tool. She critiques partial historical accounts while layering them with Amazonian perspectives on historic and contemporary issues. Cuatro Caminos is an installation that confronts Western landscape representation by reworking an archival illustration from the French travel journal Le Tour du Monde. The installation consists of a two-dimensional painting and a mokawa, a polychrome ceramic vessel containing water. The image exemplifies how scientific expeditions in the 19th century visually framed the Amazon as an empty space available for exploration, classification, and extraction. The artist transferred the exact illustration from the Tour du Monde, tracing it with dark rubber sap on a white canvas surface, evoking the ink on paper rendition. While the depiction itself does not illustrate a violent scene from the years of rubber tapping and torture in the region, using its sap alludes to the tree's agency as a memory-bearing being. The title Cuatro Caminos invokes the convergence of four realms. According to the Quichua cosmology, existence is structured through three interrelated worlds: Hanan Pacha, the upper world occupied by deities; Kai Pacha, the earthly world shared by humans, plants, animals, and other beings; and Uku Pacha, the inner world associated with both death and regeneration. Alomoto proposes a fourth domain, the intangible, conceived as the connecting field through which these three worlds intersect. The trees, rendered as animate presence rather than passive landscape elements, are framed above and below by Omagua ancestral motifs. Alomoto notes that these designs, repeatedly found on century-old ceramic vessels, signify the spirit of the forest. Transmitted across generations, the motifs stand as embrace to those who continue to endure the residues of historical and ongoing extraction. Positioned before the canvas is a mokawa, painted with the same motifs. Its interior depicts the forest, while its exterior invokes the forest spirit through the Omagua designs. Filled with water that gradually evaporates, the mokawa stages a meditation on material transformation, the visible becoming invisible, matter turning intangible, yet still connected in dialogue through its presence in relation to other elements in the room, or in this case in the gallery. By reanimating an archival image through living materials and indigenous epistemologies, the artist transforms representation into a site of ethical encounter, where land emerges as a sentient, relational, and historically situated presence. And here's the connection to other works in the galleries, either talking about the rubber boom or using archives as part of daily dialogues with contemporary issues. Colectivo TAWNA is a film collective dedicated to telling stories from and about the Amazon. In Quechua, the most widely spoken language in this part of the Amazon, TAWNA refers to the oar that steers a canoe. As a metaphor, it evokes direction, resistance, and transformation. True to this spirit, the collective brings together filmmakers, visual artists, and storytellers to translate Amazonian cosmologies and sociocultural realities into layered audiovisual narratives, imagining futures in which these ways of life expand and renew themselves. Nyukashuti Man explores the liminal condition of urban indigeneity. The 4 photographs presented here belong to a larger multimedia installation of 17 images with video, collage, and sound. In this work, TAWNA's co-founder Sani Montawano and her sisters pay tribute to their mother, Carmelina Ushiwa, a Zapara woman forced into marriage and displaced from her home in Old Yanchanacocha to the city of Puyo. In the city, Ushiwa created her forest outside the forest, a space of her own to raise her daughters through the teachings of her community. Animals, plants, and spirits became channels of memory. In these photographs, the Montawano sisters inhabit these memories as they bathe in the river, dye their hair pitch black with wituk, an endemic fruit, gather for Wayusa ceremonies at the break of dawn, and remember her mother within this intimate sororal setting. Working from their mother's stories and their own memories, the sisters turn to photography to retrace their path and situate their identity as Zapara women living between the city and the forest. Again, to draw some connections are to the different experiences of urban indigeneity and displacement. And last but not least, a descendant of the distinguished lineage of artists, Wilfredo Lusitante Piaguaje understands painting and other art-making practices as a form of life, resistance, and survival. For the Pai, or Seco Pai people, visual expression has sustained the spirituality through an enduring bond with their ancestral territory. Located along the northern border of Ecuador and Peru, Pequeya is their ancestral territory, spiritual center, and getaway to other worlds. Over 80 years ago, the Secopai were displaced from this place by rubber exploitation, geopolitical conflict, and evangelical missions. For generations, returning to Pequeya was only possible through memory, dreams, or yagué visions or ayahuasca visions. In 2023, the Ecuadorian justice system formally recognized the Secopai's rightful ownership of Pequeya, marking a historic legal victory. When commissioned a work for this exhibition, Lusitante Piaguaje entrusted the images to his yagué visions, affirming that the spirits would determine how best to communicate the Secopai's message. He described a vision of a canoe that had been long abandoned. An elder stands beside it while he prepares its return to Pequeya. Metaphorically, he is preparing the Secopai nation, which had been disconnected from their culture, endowing them with ancestral knowledge for this journey back home. In front of him descends the yagué vine embodied as a boa, both long-standing emblems of power and spirituality. In the lower right corner, a traditional Secopai vessel reaffirms cultural continuity. Despite ongoing physical and social devastation caused by oil extraction and spills, and now mining, that have claimed the lives of many Pai elders and wisdom keepers, Lusitante Piaguaje's vision stands as a testament of reclamation, staging Pequeya as a sacred site that is actively reimagined, defended, and restored through spiritual and political resolution. And here I'm drawing some connections to Pablo Amaringo's ayahuasca paintings, again, the displacement of La Chorrera of many Nunuya artists, and the relations of Elías and the Guarani people to the sacred Agarrobo. To conclude, I would like to underscore the shared framework guiding both the research project and the exhibition. Each presents the Amazon not as a fixed entity, but as a region constituted through shifting historical, cultural, ecological, and political relations. The collaborative structure, sustained dialogues, and transregional exchanges embedded in these initiatives emphasize the Amazon's vastness and complexity, challenging long-standing static and reductionist representations. In doing so, both projects affirm the Amazon as a living, contested, and continually re-articulated space. Thank you.
See?
If you want, we can open for some questions from the audience. Anyone would like to share any comments, any questions? Please let me know. Great, thank you.
I think past 5 years, I started studying Amazonian drawings from 70s and 80s, and I learned that before that they didn't have any tradition of making artworks on papers, and like when you're preparing these exhibitions, since they don't have a much history of making artworks on canvas or papers, but more with porcelain or ceramics, what was their reactions?
So this is an exhibition that was put together by 9 different curators, and I think every curator would have its own perspective and experience in talking to the artists. And each country or territory also has their different relation to artworks or to art making. There are countries like Brazil or Peru that have a very long-standing tradition of art making, like traditional art making, because they had schools in Pucallpa and Iquitos, for example, that have like more than 100 years. So they do have an art historical legacy, whereas in other countries, not so much in the sense of a Western understanding of art. I think that's what you're referring to. And in that sense, this exhibition wanted to privilege more contemporary artists than modern or previous historical renditions of art. So I think we all, as curators, we all approached it in different ways. I just give an explanation of what I did in the Ecuadorian context. And yeah, there were many other artists that I interviewed or that I had conversations with that had paintings and canvases, as you're mentioning, and others that didn't. It was a matter of trying to portray a more diverse, group of art making processes and practices.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. All of you were amazing. Actually, I would like to ask Maria regarding the cartography, because I think maps can be flawed, considering people coming from other areas and then, let's cut this piece and so and so. My question is regarding, do you see overlapping in places? So, for example, you find something that, the Spanish say, oh, this did that happen here, and then you would find the same group but being described in another conquistador perspective. Do you understand? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. We see that all the time because map making is really wishful thinking. And when it comes to the 16th and 17th centuries, you have not just the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but you also have the Dutch, the English, the French, and you have the different missions competing as well. So depending on who is making a map, you will have completely different results. Even when they, as so many of Jesuit maps, you see an overlapping of empiric experience and wishful thinking and indigenous informant sources. So sometimes you see, you have very different results. Right now, I'm studying one particular lake, for example, that it appears in the map that Carmen showed from actually quite late until the late 18th century. It was still showing. And each time it's going to be in different places. Sometimes it will coincide. It's going to have different shapes. And because, for example, a lake can function or a river can function as a frontier, as a border. So there was a lot of manipulation in this sense well into the 19th century when it comes to hydrography. Because where a river passes, normally that is where you're going to draw a frontier between countries. But where does the river pass? So for example, we speak about Tordesillas, the treaty that divides the empires. Now we have satellites that tells us where 300 something leagues west of Cape Verde, there's Tordesillas. But when we are in the middle of the Amazon in the early 17th century, where is this? So it's a narrative. The map is a narrative, and it has to do with political power, with wishful thinking, and with oral history, with imagination. It has to do with imagination a lot, with agendas, political agendas, all that in a map. Thank you. No, it's excellent because sometimes, for example, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much, but in this particular case of this lake that I'm studying, for a long time, people have, it's called Parime or Parimé, depending on the source. It would be more or less between where nowadays is Brazil and what nowadays is Venezuela. So it used to be thought that this lake was simply imagined, because it was put there by Europeans that were listening to indigenous informants. But it was also connected in the sources to El Dorado that you guys had. So because in Lake Parime would be the imperial city of Manoa, which would be the what the Spanish called El Dorado. So it was a place for richness to be found. Later, in the 19th century, this existence of this lake is going to be dismissed. Humboldt and others will say, no, it never existed. But more recent scientists have been thinking that perhaps it did exist and it was drained, like sometimes lakes disappear. So what would it tell us? It tells us that the imagination of this lake was also connected to indigenous oral history, because the informants that were informing the map makers were talking about what indigenous people were telling them. So it's a lot, it's a lot also to think about in terms of, indigenous oral history that was not really written directly, but we, the three of us that deal with early modern sources, we have to go to the sources and read them a little bit against the grain and critically to try to find things. And of course, also science is a big ally for us. That's why, Patricia was talking a lot about the need for us to be interdisciplinary. Not just interdisciplinary history, art history, and literature. No, really, hydrography, climatology, archaeobotanic. We all need to come together to try to understand the history of indigenous peoples and of the Amazon.
Thank you. Here, two questions, here and there.
Actually, my question is building on yours. So when you were talking about the maps, one of the things that came to mind to me is the way that maps were drawn in other parts of the world by colonialists. So the way the maps of Jerusalem were depicted at that time period by Christian pilgrims. So I was wondering, because the Jesuits was such an important component of that kind of New World mission, is there any kind of aspect of religious iconography that is part of that cosmos, so to speak, and storytelling?
Well, she wants me to answer this because I also, because I do the Jesuit. No, but because I also did write an article about Jesuit cartography. Yes. And there's this map that was printed in Quito, but it was made by Samuel Fritz, who was a Bohemian Jesuit. And the cartouche, the text, I mean, he talks about, he has these crosses. And the crosses lead you back to the map, and those are the places where the Jesuits became martyrs, basically in the Amazon. So I think that that's a very Jesuit thing too, because it has to do with martyrdom that is very important for the Jesuits.
And in this particular map that Carmen's referring to, that was made by the Samuel Fritz, which in theory was the first one drawn from empirical experience of the river. Interesting, the use of light is very interesting. So the light is going to be falling on the Spanish side of the river. The Portuguese side isn't dark, so maps are images. That's how we do the maps. We don't look at maps like the positivistic way. Okay, this is not even Google Maps is neutral. Google Maps map, as we see, goes back to Mercator. That's why Greenland is bigger than Brazil in Google Maps. But no map is apolitical, and of course those maps, the use of light meant zones that had been converted. So they were using all these sorts of devices to create ideologically.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. I was curious about the Lamchama presentation, and curious about the objects that you were able to see and to study in connection to, I guess my question that I'm trying to formulate is, have you been in also, or if your research includes conversations with, say, the people that today use Lamchana, because it's like a practice used in multiple groups of people and communities. And my understanding often is that many artists that use Lamchana today that I know haven't even had a chance to see such an old use of Lamchana, right? So I'm curious if there's a bridge that you establish or you're planning to establish between people who contemporarily use Lamchana and these objects in Spain. You know what I'm trying to say?
You're totally right. Actually, when we decided to work on this project, the idea was, and I was talking about this morning, moving away from our comfort zone and doing ethnographic work too, right? Because historians have to use new methods if we want to work in this region, especially. I have talked to artisans working with ceramics, the ones, special, some of the women that Diana has talked about, not artists who are working with lanchamas. I would try to do it, but maybe not even artists working with lanchamas. Perhaps people who are living the Zapara, for example, who are making the lanchamas in a more traditional way. But yeah, that would require a very different type of work. The other thing is that I have been talking with some anthropologists who have worked with Wow women, for example, and they use it in a very different way too, and it's more connected to maternity. So I guess that there's many possibilities that are open in the present. I do deal with things that are, then I have the 19th century lanchamas. I don't have an 18th century lanchama, and I don't think that I could find one, probably.
We have two, okay, perfect. Let's do that's two questions, and then we will have a 5 minutes. I don't know why I was talking far from the microphone. We'll have a 4 to 5 minutes break, and then we'll come back for the
Yes. Hi. To piggyback on the lachamas, I was wondering the the use of the lachamas to basically present by Jesuits as new converted Christians as a colonies time they to present new converted Christians in all white, and was lachamas used in the same way.
And I think that I may have missed something, but what I was trying to say is that the lanchamas are there, just as many other things and technologies and knowledges from the Amazon, and what the missionaries are doing is taking those traditions and Christianizing them. It's an appropriation and transformation of that tradition. And that's something that you see with pigments, you see with these textiles, you see with the feather work as well, because I mean, those are very old traditions that are being completely transformed. And by the way, there's something that I also wanted to say is that I am an early modernist, but usually I define myself as I do colonial studies, because you have to understand them in the context of colonial relations of power.
Okay, this question is for Patricia. So you talked about a very unique approach to the way that you're leading the project, which is very holistic. So a bunch of disciplines that are coming together. I know you haven't completed it yet. You still have the Leticia trip, but what are early findings that this methodology have brought to light that wouldn't otherwise?
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, as Carmen and Maria and Diana were all mentioning, somehow this brings all of this together. So I said, what does it mean to do this from an art historical perspective, but that doesn't mean staying within art history, and why we decided to do this. It's because a lot of what has been studied in terms of the material culture of the region was either, done through, let's say, archaeological work or a lot of contemporary art, which, as you know, is something that is being talked a lot about recently, but not really thinking either of a specific period that we saw bridges and connects, and on the other hand, bringing, art history into the question, as I said, I think poses a lot of challenges to us as art historians who want to become involved in the region. As Carmen said before, there are challenges such as, for example, bringing in ethnographic documents to look or to think about material culture that is no longer extant, for example. But it's not just a matter of replacing, but also of what happens if we think about a lot of these objects in artistic terms. Valuing artistic components, bringing in the visual analysis that a lot of times art historians do, but at the same time, bringing into art history components of oral history, bringing in sound, bringing in other sensorial connections that sometimes are left out of the picture of art history. So I think ultimately it's about complementing, and as Maria was also saying, having a dialogue with disciplines that are never put into the picture anyways, because traditionally you would say, art history is interdisciplinary in of itself, and you need a little bit of the humanities in general. But nowadays, and in particular in the Amazon, there are other ways of thinking together. And I also think it brings the practice a lot more into community work and thinking jointly as a project, and not, individually, everyone in her own little space or speciality, right? So I think it's, we were having an earlier conversation today with students at Stony Brook precisely about this, about how art history has been a field that traditionally is, conservative and has been, opening up to this more interdisciplinary dialogue. But I think this puts it, it gives us a challenge that goes even beyond that. And that's also something that, let's say, studying the specific area brings that to the forefront. Do you want to add anything? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I would like to introduce Fernando Lofredo, who is going to be in conversation and moderating Valeria Mailer. I'm going to introduce Fernando now. He's assistant professor of early modern Mediterranean and colonial visual culture at Stony Brook University and principal investigator of the Max Planck Partner Group Grant 2022-2027, Empires, Environments, Objects, in collaboration with the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú in Lima and the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence. Fernando will introduce and moderate a conversation with Valeria Mailer, founder and director of Ruge el Bosque. This panel will also include 2 pre-recorded poetry readings by poets Elías Caurey and Maria Clara Charupi Joa. which Valeria will introduce as part of her presentation. Thank you very much again, and please enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with a lot of friends and colleagues who are actually and currently working on the Amazon region. It's also a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Valeria Meilier, who is assistant professor at the Department of Hispanic Languages and Literatures and core faculty member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative at Stony Brook University. She is the director of Ruge el Bosque, a project about environmental and plurilingual poetics that aims to initiate transnational and intercultural conversations about the role of literature in Abya Yala in the context of the current climate crisis. Ruge el Bosque seeks to highlight how poetic production shapes production shapes emerging policies and literary ecologies, and serves especially in indigenous communities as grassroots tool for the preservation of ecosystems and endangered languages. Organized as a series of regional anthologies, each volume strives to be a site of preservation and resistance for communities and territories. The first volume, Ruge el Bosque, Eco-Poetry of the Southern Cone, was published in 2023. The second volume, Ruge el Bosque, Eco-Poetry of Mesoamerica, came out in 2024. The third volume, Eco-Poetry of the Amazon, is forthcoming later this year, and we're very much looking forward to it. Subsequent volumes will focus on the Andes, volume number 4, Guyanas and the Caribbean, volume number 5, and Turtle Island, volume number 6. Please join me in welcoming Valeria.
Well, thank you for everybody who stayed. This is a long conversation. This panel is called The Poetics of Land Relations, and I want to begin by acknowledging that we are in Lenni Lenape territory as we're going to talk about the land. Gerson Pizango Narváez, Nusat Benavides de la Cruz, Vilca Ampichi López, Ulises Rumiche Quintimari, Estela Casanto, Santiago Vega Chota, Benjamín Ríos Urimichi, Mario López Huanca, Francisco Pinedo Ramírez, Cristian Java Ríos, Exil Ruiz Ortiz, Jorge Ríos Pérez, Alfredo Bracro, Neuenwander, Roberto Carlos Pacheco Villanueva, Lorenzo Comiti Chávez, Gonzalo Pío Flores, Erasmo García Grau, Yenes Ríos Bozanzano, Lorenzo Wampangui Yampic, Santiago Contorincón Antunes, Lucio Pascual Yumanga, Quito Inuma Alvarado, Jesús Beri Antayagua Quispe, Santiago Meléndez Dávila, Edwin Chota Valera, Leonanzo Quintísima Meléndez, Emilio Mariche Wansi, Arbildo Menéndez, Wilaim López Ijuma, Mauro Píos Pena, Chemington Flores Crispín. This talk begins in an unorthodox way. It brings together the names of 32 murdered indigenous leaders. I transcribe them exactly as they appear in Aquellos Otros Mundos, a large-scale work by Santiago Yaguarcani, a self-taught artist from the Aymeni clan of the Huitoto nation in the northern Peruvian Amazon. And the figures are very small, but if you look down, those small yellow figures are the ones that represent each of the indigenous leaders that I just mentioned, and they have their names. These indigenous men and women are not only mentioned by their full names in Yaguarcani's painting, but a small figure holding a banner within the picture contextualizes their death. I'm gonna read it. From 2013 to 2023, 32 indigenous leaders who defended their territories from invaders, narcos, and logging mafias were murdered. They belong to the Huicha, Cacataibo, Ashaninka, Kukuma, Janeja, and Nomatsiwenga nations. Some of the widows, and I would like to add widowers too, have been seeking justice for 9 years. The Amazon is the most dangerous place for indigenous citizens. A quick search on the internet confirms something that the audience might already suspect. Most of the names yield no results. A few names, along with the violent circumstances of their deaths, are modestly recorded on local and regional environmental websites. Although there is rarely any record indicating that the perpetrators of the crimes were brought before a court of justice. Among the few cases registered in the public sphere is that of Lorenzo Wampakit Jamil, a park ranger of the Shayu Naim Communal Reserve in the Peruvian Amazon, murdered at the age of 54 in 2020. The pandemic was a major aggravating factor in the already precarious situation of land defenders and indigenous leaders in the Peruvian Amazon, who suffer severe abandonment by governments preoccupied with containing the health crisis. To the death of Lorenzo must be added the murders of Gonzalo Pío Flores, Álvido Meléndez Grandes, and Roberto Pacheco Villanueva, all environmental activists, the later of whom had received numerous death threats by the time of his death. The communities of all these activists correspond to key access points for the exploitation of the Amazon's natural resources, including illegal logging and gold mining. Violence against environmental activists in the Amazon is not a historical reality specific to Peru, nor to the context of the pandemic, nor to the contemporary extractivism that's been so much talked about today. Rather, it is a long-standing phenomenon. Many land defenders have risked their lives in the struggle to defend human and territorial rights in the Amazon. One of the most emblematic historical cases with whom many of you might know of is probably that of Brazilian rubber taper and union leader Chico Mendes, who opposed the harsh conditions of rubber extraction and the expansion of cattle pastures in the Amazon rainforest. Mendes was murdered in 1988 by a hitman hired by Grileiro Darrell Alves, who had spent decades illegally occupying land and displacing indigenous peoples and campesinos in the Amazon, and who ordered Mendes' execution. Neither Mendes' case, nor that of the 33 indigenous leaders described by Yahuarcani, nor that of the Peruvian activists murdered during the pandemic are isolated incidents. Rather, they are part of a systematic plan aimed at terrorizing and displacing rural and indigenous communities of Abya Yala, which is the name that indigenous leaders and their allies used to describe the hemispheric Americas. It's a term from the Guna people that signifies land in full plenitude. So it is a systematic plan to terrorize the communities of Abya Yala in order to enable the advancement of the extractive frontier. Recent statistics are alarming, and I'm going to share some of them with you. More than 2/3 of the murders of land defenders in 2019 occurred in Latin America, which has consistently been the most affected region since Global Witness began publishing data in 2012. In this context, many voices have been silenced, it is true, but also new challenges of resilience and futurity have emerged, particularly in art and literature, which are beginning to shape a distinctive aesthetic of land defense within cultural production. Ruge el Bosque, Volume 3, Ecopoetry of the Amazon, analyzes the possibilities of this phenomenon in contemporary poetry, in many cases written by land defenders about the defense of the land. In other words, it seeks to outline a form of poetic discourse that subverts the long tradition of territorial extraction in Abya Yala. When together with my co-editors, Whitney DeVos and Javiera Perez Salerno, we began working on this poetic project in 2021, the aim behind these anthologies was to signal multiple entry points to the poetic tradition of the territories of Abya Yala. That is, to think both poetry and the land in a way that challenges settler poetic traditions and conceives it from the plurality of languages, cultures, and ecosystems. In our attempts to respond to the question of how such plural traditions might take shape, this book dedicated to the Amazon was preceded by two others, the first one to the Southern Cone, the second one to Mesoamerica, and across those two volumes, more than 40 contemporary poets came together writing in around a dozen languages, including Creole, languages such as Brelician Creole, border languages such as Portuñol, Afro-Indigenous languages such as Garifuna, and a vast range of indigenous languages, including Chana, Guarani, Guna, Maya Quiché, Nahuatl, and Yucatec Maya. The wide variety of linguistic expressions and worldviews that these poets deployed in the pages of those two books not only confirm that literatures in indigenous languages do exist. They also assert that despite the enormous pressure exerted on them by colonial languages, these literatures are particularly relevant to conversations about the defense of the land. In 2013, the Guatemalan Quiché activist, feminist, and Nobel Prize laureate Rigoberta Menchutum asked, and I'm going to quote her, "How many humans have been sacrificed to the gods of capital over the past 500 years?" End of quote. Her words are echoed by present-day activists and land defenders who continue to denounce and resist the advancement of the extractive frontier over the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples. Ruge el Bosque, this project on plurilingual poetry, aims to create a repertoire of contemporary poetry that engages with land defense and that, in a way, contests what Mapuche scholar Luis Cárcamo Huechante has called acoustic colonialism by attending to how plurilingual literatures both challenge the nation state as a privileged entryway to the study of literature and propose regional and transnational environmental approaches, and debunks the monolingual understanding of the nation of national literatures, exposing that monolinguism as the base of cultural discrimination and territorial devastation. So, today, linguistic extinction is not a passive phenomenon. It is a consequence of the active killing of indigenous languages. Today, land depletion isn't either. This ecocide, what some scholars have come to talk about as the sixth extinction, stems directly from settlers' administration of indigenous land. I'll share some numbers with you that we have found out as we were doing research for the prologue of this new anthology. In the case of the Amazon, official state languages such as Portuguese, Spanish, English in Guyana, Dutch in Suriname, and French in French Guiana have decimated indigenous languages dramatically. Today, nearly half of the 330 languages spoken in the region have fewer than 500 speakers. These processes of linguicide remain ongoing, sustained both by forms of continuous displacement driven by road construction, deforestation, agribusiness, mining, and oil extraction, and by states' failure to establish, institutionalize, and successfully maintain cultural responsible forms of education in indigenous languages. So, how can we think differently about the forest so that we can establish cultural and linguistic good relations with the land? Or better yet, echoing Eduardo Con's words, how does the forest think? Grounded in his observation of the Runa people, a community of the Ecuadorian Amazon, Con coins the concept of the Great Whole, to refer to how in the rainforest people exist as part of a broader semiotic system that unfolds in continuity with other beings and with other territories. My colleague, Cherokee scholar Joseph Pierce, who couldn't be with us today, for his part proposes the concept of speculative relations to think about the nature of these modes of relating proposed by indigenous cosmologies and epistemologies. I'm going to quote him. Speculation is a core principle of indigenous cosmologies and cultural practice, philosophy, and metaphysics. A principle that involves extending beyond oneself and towards other beings, other forms of life, other knowledges, and expressive capacities. If extending beyond oneself is an act of speculation, then relational paradigms are inherently speculative. I finished the quote. If, as Con and Pierce teach us the interrelational lies at the very heart of indigenous thought. In our anthology, we attempt the speculative exercise of thinking together with the territories and the waters, in togetherness with the languages and the people that constitute the Amazon as part of a continuum, and of imagining a future of good relations for its human as well as its non-human entities. The poets teach us ways in which broken relationships can be repaired and interrelational thinking can carry us forward. To a certain extent, as we seek to unravel in this anthology, to think interrelationally, in the case of the Amazon, is to think transnationally and to dream of new ways of conceiving the forest as a living whole. And as we transition into the reading of the poets themselves, I just want to mention that that relationality also expands to the formal aspects of this poet's practice. And we can talk about this more, but just let me mention that Shipiyo Koniwo artist and poet Chonon Bensho is a clear example of this. She's both anthologized in the book that I'm presenting and has a piece downstairs. So I think that the modes in which these poets propose their land defense projects has to do with imagining altogether new forms of doing art. And now I'm going to introduce to you, I think Elías comes first. Okay, Elías Caurey, who is a Guarani sociologist and anthropologist, part of the Autonomía Guarani, Charagua, Iyambe. After leaving his community to pursue higher education, he committed himself to making Guarani knowledge visible in both Guarani and Spanish. He specialized in linguistic revitalization at the University of Mondragon. And I just want to mention that linguistic revitalization projects, land defense, and poetry triangulate themselves in a way that cannot be disentangled in many of these practitioners. He has published more than 20 written works and produced over 30 audiovisual pieces of indigenous, especially Guarani topics. He's a composer and a poet, and he's the author of Niepotica Peguarán, Canto al Bosque, and a two-time recipient of the Premio Plurinacional Eduardo Avaroa. In 2019, he represented indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean on the steering committee of UNESCO for the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and he currently works in indigenous education and media in Charagua. And you can also see a video of his downstairs in the exhibition. I think Elías had great fun filming this video, so I hope you will enjoy it too. Oh, okay, so they changed the order of the slides I sent. So I wasn't prepared. So the second poet whose video we're going to look at today is María Clara, who is a Shuar poet from Morona, Santiago, Ecuador, currently based in Quito. She holds a degree in Sustainable Local Development from the Universidad Politécnica Salesiana and is a member of the Academia Nacional de Historia. And she shared, we always ask the poets that we anthologize, that they send us what we call an eco-biography. So a biography that has to do with the relationship to the land. So they always share stories in relationship to that, and this is María Clara's. The insult Jibara, once used against her and her community, became a rebellious and visionary force that led her to carry Shuar oral traditions into poetry. She's the author of Mujeres of Taramait, and co-author of several anthologies, including Hijas de Latinoamérica and Mujeres Amazónicas en la Ciudad. Her work has been recognized for preserving her mother tongue brought through poetry and for her advocacy for the rights of workers from the oil sector. She believes that institutional support and commitment from authorities to preserve indigenous languages is limited, and she's right. And she fears that her language might not appeal to the Shuar youth, who increasingly prefer to learn from other cultures and traditions other than their own. And so since we're going to see the poets' videos, and I was thinking that the order would be a little different, I'll just close up with what I have prepared for the end, so I'll spoil the end. To conclude this presentation, and I think I can... Okay, so I'm just gonna close with this today, which is a work by Fernando which you can find here at the Library of the Americas Society. In this piece, the Peruvian artist speculates around the name Americas Society and reframes it as Abya Yala Society. In a way, he too, like Amazonía Azul, like Ruge el Bosque, echoes the word of Maya Quiché scholar Emil Quemé, who has stated that for Abya Yala, this land in full plenitude, to live, the Americas must die. Bryce and Quemé borderless idea for the continent, which I think has become particularly relevant in light of this country's heinous violence against immigrants, share the speculative territorial dream of a Yuk Mije linguist Yasnaya Aguilar, which I'm going to read to you. It's a quote from her book, This Mouth is Mine. And I want you all to try to imagine what she proposes. Let's imagine a world not divided into those legal political entities known as countries. What would that world be like? How would it be organized? I am under no illusion that I'll ever get the chance to live in a post-nation state world. But let no one ever say that I did not dream about it. End of quote. So with this decolonial dream of and for the land, I will conclude this talk about the poetics of land relation, and I thank you all for listening, and I will present the videos of the poets to you.
Queréis papel, amo lo camarada mi opa que queda derecho en cuarenta de Chacaruki. Estamos muy contentos de poder compartir dos poemas de nuestra autoría en el marco de la exhibición Amazonía Acu y que muy pronto también van a ser parte de la antología Ruge el Bosque. Voy a leerle el poema Capenguara al Bosque, que está en la página 15 de este mi libro Ñepoti Capenguara, Canto al Bosque, y el poema Cheubi, Mi Territorio, que está en la página 50 de este mi libro Yayan Duñere. Primero lo voy a hacer en guaraní y luego lo voy a hacer en castellano. Capenguara. Derete hakwami kabi añemoingue. Deraji rutiete yaike. Yua karaguata harakaranda ipute rupi. Ayando ete ipichewe oike senti rupi. Iñepe chenenireta. Acareta y yureta. Hokureta hariwitunonsa. Chembuaracua. Chemumora morareta. Cheño aguata, aniramu irundibe aguata, yaguareta, hare aguarareta o yerobio aguata, aiken de puape. Cheñe hare, characua, oñeño no cabi hocope. Ayembue hare ikua, hoy mañana hare embaero cureta, ñanepuano vai, yepea o cacayo vai, hare, iague yaubay, equayabei. Aikua. Ayembo jepe. Tallero viaja a Joko Peramu. Botacabio ñemi. Ñaneramireta iñepe. Uirareta. Jaicabio yangareco jeseramo. Ñana ñanepeva vai. Choroque. Taji. Tatayuai. Jaiurundei. Uiraro. Buisare. Kumbaro. Hariwobi opato yangare koreta chere. Hawain de plabewi. Rone pintoe pame hare. Ore de saguri. Saini, Moreno, hare taringi. Iomo esa careta oi. Tasu. Guira hare. Eitureta. Omomo potareta oi. Agüejin de pupe. Hare. Derete quaranga cheve. Harete. Yembuati. Yerure hare, puture necheve, ayemboje, derepe, chea o ibaeran dendive, aenduete ahí con dendive. De yerovia hare, de platiti llave aendubi. Cacabiwasu, aipota chacheñepe mbae, oeni baepe, hare, poenia baepe, pebenguara quae, cheñepotu. Al bosque, en tu cálido cuerpo me impregno, por tus venas me adentro, Entre mistoles, caraguatas y palmeras, siento el aroma de tus hojas tocar mis extrañas. Sus voces me llenan, ramas, espinas, hojas y brisas me enseñan, me llenan de caricias. Camino solo en compañía, jaguares y zorro caminan en algarabía. Me sumerjo en tu corazón, encuentro equilibrio entre sentimiento y razón. Aprendo y valoro, rama que cura y hojas que sanan, leña que ardes y frutos que alimentan. Sigo aprendiendo. Me detengo en tu vientre, es una delicia que lo encuentre. Regalo escondido en la voz de los abuelos, bien guardado por los árboles primigenios. Ramas que envuelven choroquete, tajibo, mora y quebracho, cacha, retama, cumbaru y alcaparro, todas me protegen. Llego a tus pulmones, compartimos oxígenos y nos mareamos, tuna, pitahaya y caraparí aclarando agua, hormigas, pájaros y abejas buscando botagua. Bajo a tus pies y tu cuerpo me cobija, en fiestas, asambleas, rituales y ocio me abrigas. Me nombro con tu nombre para ser tu esencia, en mi vida siento tu presencia, tus algarabías y tristeza hacen eco en mí. Bosque hermoso, quiero ser tu voz, para los nombrados y los sin nombrar, para ustedes mi canto. Cheubi, cheyaupa de iwitepe, reñomantu, cheputuero yandu. De cupere ayubanga, ayekoundere, cheubi michi. Cheao yero y aguata puaguibe, de yangaré cogeseramo. Chereco vende pope, oñeño batuca avión. Dereza rupia echa cheneta, ayeko un dereño, cheubi. Chepuarupicavi, chemiani, cheñepen de hipope. Chepuagui, aputu, ne cuarangape. De hiporetape, oñemuña jare. O cuacua, jori, jori, caturebe, oreubi, cheubi. Teiche tuichambove ajandegui, en imbaetiro yete, añave, coma ye, depuri, cheubi, pora, aguille yerenani, emaño tae chara cuacuabe, checo che, dereco pegua, cheubi. Mi territorio. En tus extrañas cobija mi placenta, en mi respirar siento tu aliento, juego en tu espalda, me regocijo en ti, mi territorio. Mi espíritu camina seguro al amparo de tu mirada, mi vida se guarece en tus manos, veo a través de tus ojos a mi pueblo, me refugio en ti, mi territorio. Vivo en plenitud, hablando mi idioma en tu espacio, descanso feliz en tu sombra. Tus habitantes se reproducen, crecen y maduran contentos. Nuestro territorio, mi territorio. Siendo adolescente me alejé de ti, mas nunca me fui. Ahora aquí me tienes, contigo, mi territorio. Tierra hermosa, aún no te vuelques, deja que vea envejecer al tiempo. Por ti soy quien soy, mi territorio. Gracias. Yasoropay.
Yupi chuchuiti. Vini ibia kirnano. Penuk isikra. Tarachaiti nukur nupui. Nahatrua mano. Shakain. Inyah chuchuiti. Numpush. Ipek marchaiti. Nuniskash. Kunkuntri punkir awasatawe. Inin peirun. Ikyaknyak. Shintiakun arutma kunkunturiye. Isikrawe. Yapah nyaptine. Inin pein. Itermiayi. Apach kaunanyak. Anangkruawar puhutairun. Yapah kiermiayi. Churuvia ainsanang. Punkir kuinak mars. Mayen. Yukwakan. Hibara turukiar. Mahamprush. Ahatwer miayi. Mungisung pupura anis. Sapay miayi. Enento irui. Apach ni. Un trinium. kasamkarniayi. Punkir, hurunkarniayi. Kitiakrin, ikiahniakiarniayi. Ain miayat. Nukuru ahari nantara insanat. Anentrukin utiahi. Mama, sanimpri ainsan. Nikapate amuchat. Namurka hakachuiti. Angkantak nanamiawe. Unchumchuk. Wayawe. Wehei tutsuk weawe. Nuchip. Penkernum. Akiniawe. Nakich. Enkernum. Akiniawe. Chicham. Akmaki. Weathna hui. Ayumpunka. Nanchikish. Kimiaho. Kakamachuiti. Chichamur. Ikiahnia kimiaiti. Como Nantarinamur. No es fácil reconocer que habito en mí. La envoltura que me cobija no es el trach que tejió mi madre Nuncui. Tampoco es la piel de Shakain, ni su sangre hecha color. Sin embargo, el perfume que me adorna seduce mis instintos y despierto cobijada por los brazos de Rutam. Dedos mutantes que trajeron los conquistadores pretendieron confeccionar mi destino. Como águila, me deslicé bajo la piel del viento. Jíbara fue el nombre con el que me latiguearon. Ráfaga de municiones y pólvora fue la semilla en mi corazón. Tomaron para la corona española los más sagrados manjares para calmar su sed de piedra muerta. Despierto nadando en un mundo de ideas nuevas, como Nantar en la chacra de mi madre, con un canto y lloro a la vez, como semilla de yuca, números sin fin. Namur no ha muerto, vuela libre el guerrero, entra sin llamar, se va sin despidos, nace en cada esperma fértil, en cada óvulo fecundo, en la palabra que pinto. Ni la garra de la audaza Yumpum es tan fuerte como para callar mi voz. Antumianka chicham. Amini mayech ti shiram umpoa muitme. Ishichik su ahamuna nekapriahei. Chichakratme I nawe puhu ainsam. Hi tuku ikimakam takusta. Takurtamu. I chichamu kahinkiahin tusam. I nunke uhutairi tuki istarum turutami. Mankartin ainis nunca mismau enentain vinyawe. I puhutairi tishiram tuku awe. Uchi yama akinya ainin enentain trusta. Antumiang chichartukmei. Atsan nangkei kimiei. Kankapea anis achirak niño nahatmahi. Iruntra muithi kimia ni winenia. Antumahi. Arutma nahakratnio wakamiahi. Vinia ewihrui ame wakanmin achikwithe. Vinia enentuiri tata. Vinia kankantru hui pusat. Vinia ikyurkik mayeya ainsa. Voces del lago. El viento sopla bálsamos de aire en ti. Eres sonido y murmullo perceptible. Bajo nuestros pies nos hablas. Nos pides que conservemos encendido el fuego para que no se apague nuestra voz. Que cuidemos a la madre tierra, a la madre Nuncui, ante el irrazonable, ambicioso y criminal saqueo. La vida perfecta que en ella existe. y el lago me habló como a un niño recién nacido. Traspasó la barrera de la nada. Me hizo parte con la raíz que me sostiene. De su boca escuché que somos la unión con el alma del eterno Creador. He tomado tu alma en mis manos. Ven a mi corazón. Quédate, alma mía. No pases como el aire sobre mí.
Thank you very much. It's very hard to to talk and start a conversation after uh, these very moving uh, poetry readings. First of all, again, thank you so much for having me. I would like to um, add that with the partner group I am currently leading, we organized a seminar with students, with grad students last year in Pucallpa, in the Pucallpa region in Peru. And I was able to visit and learn from some of the artists that are actually present in the exhibition here downstairs. But I also would like to acknowledge, as you were mentioning, Valeria, that there are a lot of the interconnection between defense of the land and defense of the language is crucial. And in our case, for instance, we collaborated with the Chana project, is a linguistic station in Pucallpa, supported by the Max Planck Society and the University of Zurich, with University of the PUC University of Lima. And I was very interested in the fact that in the group of, the communities that you mentioned of the martyrs, right, of the people who are killed, there are the Yanisha and the Cacataibo, and actually Roberto Sarikei and Mariana Poblete, who are leading the Chana station, work specifically on those communities. And they work with them, and they try, they're linguists, but they do their best to help them protect their land and to have a voice in the political landscape, which is extremely difficult, as you can imagine. So, first of all, I would like to, start this conversation with a very basic question, because I think that the public does not know very well your project or might not know your project. My first question for you would be, why ruge el bosque?
Yeah, I would just like to say that Chana language, there's a really great article in the New York Times that because a lot of the time it's thought that languages get extinct, but actually they're dormant and they
Yes.
can come back to life. And so there's this article that says, you can find it, says like, a language was believed extinct, then a man spoke. And the Chana language was transmitted. It's a language that you almost don't move your lips to speak, and it's like very quiet. And it had been like the last documents were Jesuit documents that they had on this language, and then they found out that this family in Entre Rios had been passing it on until the present. But Ruge el Bosque is actually a line from Marosa di Giorgio that says, Ruge el Bosque y la luna da órdenes, so the forest roars and the moon gives orders. So when I began working on this project, I was trying to think about the concept of eco-poetry, which is a concept that's coined in Anglophone academia to speak about deliberately ecologically engaged poetry, and it's coined in the 1990s. But the first time that the term eco-poetry is used is actually, fun fact, by Nicanor Parra in 1982 in Chile, and he calls for making an e-constitution, so an ecological constitution. And so I thought, well, this coin is coined in the Anglophone world, in the global north, but there might be a lot of other entry points for thinking about ecologically engaged poetry in the global south, and particularly in Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist. And so I think Marosa Di Giorgio's dreamy, queer, weird landscapes in poetry offered an entryway for that. Nicanor Parra's politically engaged poetry offered another entryway. Indigenous poetry, as it stands, and its project of land defense offered an entryway as well. And so I started thinking, okay, there's a lot of work to be done here.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you another question? So, of course, the forest is very important. We were discussing that, etc. One might ask you, and what about the desert? What about those regions that are not covered with bosque, a forest? How do you include those territories in this idea that we also saw in the first, in the first video? The bosque, the forest was so present on purpose, most probably, right?
Well, it's a very bad answer, but we had to call it something, and we really like this line, and then we want to cover all the territories of what has become known as the hemispheric Americas and think about different landscapes. But even the Amazon is not only
not at all.
It's not only tropical forest. It encompasses a lot of other territories, both natural and urban, and I think that, yeah, like accounting for the Amazon at this point and its reverberations even forces us to speak about Jeff Bezos' Amazon and like its new project of like sort of seamless extractivism, which is what a lot of the colonial conquistadores were proposing of this landscape as well, right? And so where does a landscape end, or where does a territory end, or where does an idea of the land ends? And I think that's the really interesting thing. I really like how in the last video, Maria Clara is sitting on top of the roof, and there's a dog, and the mountains are there, but also all these cables, and all of it is the landscape, or challenges the idea of the landscape in a way that makes us think that this divides that Western thought has given us to think about very discrete forms of designating things might not help. And so the forest might not be a great name, but we had to work with language, right?
I'm not saying it's not a great name, actually. Maria Clara was on a rooftop, which is not a common place to read poetry, right? And talking about getting out from the comfort zone, as Carmen was saying, it is very challenging, even visually. And both videos were actually filmed from above, right? At least part of them. I would like to ask you about the interconnections between poetry and art and visual culture. Maria Clara says, palabras que pinto, words that I'm painting. There are then other connections with the geometrical, geometrical kene, which is typical of the Shipibo Konibo community. And for them is extremely they're not even interrelated, they're the same thing. The shapes and the Icaros, which are the songs, I'm kind of bad, it's a very bad translation, that they sing according to the to what they see in the in those forms. I wanted to ask you. Of course, this is a series of books on poetry. What if you have thought about that relationship with the forms, with art production, visual culture?
It's a very scary question in a room full of art historians and curators. But I have thought about this particularly because I have started to find that a lot of these artists and poets have interdisciplinary porous practices that inform each other, where language and the visual are not separated. And in a way, I would like to quote my colleagues Rita Palacios and Paul Worley, who have a book that's called Unwriting Mayan Literature. And so and they read textiles, for instance, and I'll keep it short because I'm sure everybody is exhausted. But I think I wanted to bring to close this, something that Nahuatl poet Martín Tonameyo taught me in an interview I did with him for Rugel Bosque, his anthologized in the second anthology. He's a wonderful poet. But he told me that poetry for the Nahuatl people, he's not a poet. The poets are the curanderos and the rezadores who make rain happen, who pray for the sick to be cured. And so there's a performative dimension to how this community think about poetry, to put it in Western terms. So even like the categories through which in Western academia we have thought of a lot of this works has to be challenged. And I think this practitioners propose different ways of thinking, and even bilingual poetry, many of them self-translate. Some of them use other translators. The translations into English that were at the bottom were done by Whitney DeVos and me. But there's this idea of tequio literario, so like collective labor. Like there's not an original, right? If the text is bilingual, which came first? And if both of the texts correspond to the same author? And so in a way they challenge the idea of like authorship, art. And I think that I'm really thinking about this right now. I don't have a fully formed answer, but I am very interested in continuing to think about this. I think we can have a lot more conversations over a glass of water.
Just the last remark, I was very intrigued by what you were saying about the untranslatable dimension of this poetry. Maria Clara used in her own translation into Spanish, she used two original words, trach and shakaim. I don't know what they mean, but she decides not to translate them, even if it's a Spanish translation. So this gives you a little bit a dimension of how untranslatable sometimes are, the languages of the poet. A very last comment. I think that something extremely important, together with visual culture and together with poetry and language and defense of the territory, is actually the food culture of those communities, which is part of their lives. And it's part of the way in which they conceive life, and we all conceive life. When we hear phrases like leaves that cure, of course, leaves can cure, but can be also eaten. And that was my last comment. If you can think a little bit about also the relationship between poetry and food culture, which I notice is very, very strong at least in the regions of the Amazon that I have explored.
I have not thought about that yet. But to the thing that you said about untranslatability, I think that a lot of the times I spoke about the term acoustic colonialism. A lot of the times the poets leave, though, first of all, like there's this relationship between indigenous languages and colonial languages that name and see the world in different ways, right? And they're working through both. But a lot of the times they don't translate terms so that the reader has to confront the indigenous languages because they know that a lot of the time the original language is included as an ornamental or fetishizing element that nobody even takes the time to look at. And so linguist Yahnaya Aguilar, she's asked for a text in Ayuk and Spanish, and Spanish, and she sends a text that's like really different. And it's like, and in the one in Mije, she writes like, I don't care, I'm just gonna put anything here because anyways, you're not gonna read it. And somebody realizes that this text is a lot shorter and it's like, hey, like, Yasnaya, what did you do? And she's like, they, like, people like don't even look at the language. So what the exercise that we did today, even like bearing space for confronting a language that doesn't sound familiar at all to many of us, and holding that space and being uncomfortable with not understanding is a really important exercise, since like there's a sonic dimension to languages, and many of us can recognize a lot of Western colonial languages when we hear them in the street, even if we don't speak them, but almost none of us can distinct between Shuar and Guarani, right? So I'm sorry, I don't have any notes on food, but I think about it. Someone said wine.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And commenting on the last quotation you had, this decolonial quotation about nation, probably we have to move forward and think not only of decolonizing, but also we have to think of a nationalized word, which would be probably even better. Thank you all.
Thank you very much to all the speakers tonight. Diana, Carmen, Patricia, Maria, Valeria, Fernando, Elías, Maria Clara. Thank you very much, all of you, to join us. I would like to invite you to our reception next door. Our galleries are going to be open until 8 p.m. in case you want to visit Amazonia Zoo. I encourage you. The exhibition is closing on April 18. And enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.